Africa, 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 Africa.
Sedan urminnes tider har afrikanen framställts som något exotiskt och annorlunda. Eller som ett lidande offer, någon som inte klarar sig utan vår hjälp. Just nu matas vi av bilder som visar upp det krigande Afrika, där människor brutalt våldtas och dödas. Skapar de här bilderna fördomar? Påverkar de afrikaners status? Vilken är vår bild av Afrika?
Mycket fattigdom, folk som behöver hjälp för att komma igång med sitt liv, att överleva och få mat till dagen.
Jag tänker mer fattigdom. Ja, fattigdom, vad heter det, sorg. Och sen så, det är väl det första som kommer. Jag tänker också mycket sång och dans. Ja, fest och så.
Afrika, ja, det är en fattig kontinent som finns i jorden just nu.
Mycket krig, tyvärr.
Känns det som den kontinent som ligger liksom längst bak i den demokratiska utvecklingen på grund av typ europeer.
Fattigt, men vackert.
Vad tycker du om mediebilden av Afrika idag?
Den är allt för svag och vi vet alldeles för lite om Afrika. Afrika är inte enhetligt på något sätt.
Well, for many years, I think it's been coming on for many years that all the pictures that's been exported from Africa is of starving children, Ethiopian incidents of very thin, emaciated adults and children, fleas all over, abject poverty, and people that cannot help themselves. And I think those pictures were mostly taken in order to bring forth some sense of sympathy for Africans so that they can maybe get some funding for programs, which is a good intention, you know, as we would say in South Africa, in Arabic, the niyat was right, the intention was right, but then Africa had a negative image.
Personally, I think the image is what we get in Europe. It's a true reflection of what's happening in Africa. I'm always surprised that people often accuse journalists of being too negative, that they stress too much sort of crisis, war, disease situations. I think that reflects the true nature of Africa, and it would be untruthful not to report on the unfortunately many negative aspects that Africa has got and which clearly show in the economic situation or situation the continent finds itself in.
It's like people believe what they see obviously in the media. It's like oh, we're killing each other, we're crazy, killing each other, we have wars all time.
My father was very scared. He's saying, you know, why are you going to Africa? You're going to get killed. What if someone robs you? You know, what if something happens? What if you get raped? What if you this? What if you that? And he just didn't want me to go.
So why do they want to go to Africa if they're afraid? This is the point. If you're afraid, don't go to Africa then. But I believe that this way of thinking is because they don't know too much about Africa. They don't know too much about Africa. That's why they think in this way. If they had the real picture, the real image of Africa, they could act in another way.
Är det så att medierna skapar rädsla och fördomar? Vem beställer motivet som visas upp på nyheterna? Hur jobbar journalisterna på plats?
Editors in Europe and elsewhere, I mean even the United States, they do have the power to impose on you what they want, what kind of story they want, what kind of angle they want. And if you're saying that that's not what's happening, they'll come back to you and say, well, AFP says that that's what happened, or AP or Reuters says that that's what happened. And if the agency says that that's what happened, that's the way it is and you must provide that. But that's not necessarily what you find on the ground. And that's often a struggle with the editors, is I'm saying, but that's not what it looks like. And they're saying, but that's what we expect.
The responsibility for one-sided media coverage goes back to the question of who it serves. And as well, the type of media that people have been accustomed to receiving, constantly negative news, always has to have a spark to it. You want to hear about the shooting, not the girl that graduated, or you don't want to hear about the good stuff. But I think that that's been something that we've been accustomed to over a long period of time. People have been trained to want negative news. People have been trained to accept it and to focus on it.
And I feel like this is the trend, I mean, if there's a story about Michael Jackson dying on one channel, it's on all the channels. There's no variety. It's like suddenly the buzz is, white farmers dying in or being murdered in South Africa, and suddenly all the broadcasters are doing a story about that. Then there's, the next story is about, gays in Uganda. First, it took us months to actually get anyone to do a story on the gays in Uganda, because no one's interested in doing a story on gays and lesbians. Definitely not the French, let me tell you. We don't want to talk about gays and lesbians, that's our problem. As soon as BBC puts it up, everyone's running to cover a story on gays and lesbians. And so there's that sense of doing something new and creative is not there, particularly with the smaller broadcasters who feel like they have to compete. But what the shame of that is that there's so much to do in Africa. There are so many unique and beautiful, fabulous stories to do here, and people keep focusing on the same stuff. And that, to me, is disappointing.
So, in November 2010, there was a murder on a Swedish woman in the suburb of Cape Town. Were you asked to cover this story?
No, not at all, no.
So, why do you think you've been working in Cape Town for 2 years? Why weren't you asked to give a closer report?
Well, newspapers and radio stations, they prefer to work with their person in the country and or on the continent, I should say. So, for instance, the Swedish radio, they have a correspondent in Maputo, Mozambique. So every kind of information or news from Africa has to be filtered through this correspondent in Maputo. So they had to wait until she had submitted her story, and that was in the afternoon. I mean, the murder happened on the evening before, and I was informed about the murder, I guess, on the evening and the night, and so I knew about the whole thing. So if they have asked me, I could have submitted a story before lunch. I mean, with interviews in Khayelitsha and Gugulethu where the murder actually happened. But yeah, the Swedish radio, they prioritize that the information and the news comes from the right person, not that it comes in the right time, so to say.
And quite often when you talk about Africa, you always ask, and even a journalist is going to look into a certain given situation within Africa, then you ask quite often one of the experts of a given aid organization to say, what do you say about the situation now happening within Congo, for instance? You don't go and ask first and foremost a person from Congo and say, hey, listen here, can you tell me a story? Why did you move from Congo to Sweden? It's not quite often you find those people to represent themselves and tell their story. It's mostly the experts that's coming to tell the story about what's happening within other people's countries.
Afrikaner är en invandrargrupp som har de lägsta lönerna i Sverige. Det är bland dem den högsta arbetslösheten finns och den största andelen bidragstagare. Vilka möjligheter ges afrikaner på den svenska arbetsmarknaden? Elio berättar om när han var på sin första anställningsintervju i Västerås.
And I was sitting in the waiting room for the interview, and the guy who was supposed to interview me, he came to me and he just looked at me and he shook his head and he said no, and he just left me there. You know, it's really difficult to describe the feelings I had at that time, so I couldn't control my tears. They just came out.
Enligt migrationsforskare vågar många arbetsgivare inte ge afrikaner en framträdande roll i företaget. Elios syster, som har arbetat som utredare på utbildningsdepartementet i Maputo i 12 år, har just fått jobb på en restaurang i Portugal.
Her boss just said that the customers were complaining because there was a black woman in the kitchen. So she didn't want to eat food made by a black woman. So she got fired just because she's black.